So, what if I told you guys that fantasy football can better your work, like at your job efficiency? So today I'm going to be talking about what fantasy football is and the pros and cons of fantasy football. Alright, so first of all, what fantasy football is you draft your team, like you need the quarterback, 2 running backs, 2 receivers, a flex position which is either a receiver, a running back, or a tight end, a kicker, a defense, and then the rest is whatever you want. You can fill it with all quarterbacks if you want, or recommended. It basically works like by how many yards they get and touchdown passes will give you the points that they earn, and then they add up against your opponent over here. So this would be your team, and then this is your opponent's team. And you compete with him and see whoever gets the most points, and then that gives you the win. So you can see that guy won in this example. Some fantasy leagues work differently. So my league, you have to have a tight end in your team. So this is my team right here as an example. You have to have a tight end. In some other teams, some other leagues, you don't. They don't force you to have certain positions and have different rules for the game. So this is like how you get your points. So for passing yards, you get 1 point for every 25 yards you throw for a quarterback. Passing touchdowns, you get 4 points for like the quarterback position. And then these are like the main how you get your points. The defense, how the defense gets your points, and the kicker. So the benefits of playing fantasy football. So here's from an article on Quantum Workplace survey that 1,500 employees from companies across the United States found that employees who participated in fantasy football with coworkers were engaged at work by 12% points than employees who didn't play fantasy football with their work employees. So if you play fantasy football with people at work, you bonded better with them and you were more efficient at work compared to the people who play fantasy football with just friends outside of work. So here's a chart of how fantasy football has been growing in the United States from the last couple of years, from 2004 to 2013. You can see an increase in fantasy football, and job managers are actually liking this because they actually have seen an improvement in their workers. So, cons and negative effects. These are a couple people who lost, so they bet in fantasy football, and they had to put a tattoo on their body or go like that guy over there, and make a bad example in public. So yeah, the cons of fantasy football are so like it stated in Bleacher Report. They said we stopped thinking of players as humans because sometimes you wish for like your opponent's players. So you say like, oh, I wish he gets hurt, or you wish bad for a person even though they're actually a human being, and you're wishing that they get hurt or do bad. And yeah, that's it. Thank you for listening.
So, Emmanuel, you here? No, okay. Well, hang on just a second. All right, for your attention device, you've basically got a statement about how fantasy football could benefit people at the workplace. And it sounds like you're kind of hedging a little bit by talking about advantages and disadvantages. As I look at it now, that may actually have been what your preview was, and it should have been a little bit clearer that that's kind of how the structure of the speech was going to go. I thought you were just talking about what your purpose statement was going to be, but I can see maybe that's how it's going to go. So I'm going to make a little bit of adjustment in my own scoring on that. The basics of fantasy football, I think you probably could have spent the whole speech talking about that instead of just getting into some of the other things that are going on with the workplace environment or the negative things that go on with fantasy football, even though those are relatively brief. The idea about how do you pick your teams? Who are you matched up against? Is it a group? Is it an individual? It makes it sound like it's just a single individual. I'm not sure how leagues work then. If it's just exactly like the NFL and there are 28 people, or 32 people in your league, then it makes perfect sense. But if you only have 8 people in your fantasy football league, how do they manage to do all this kind of stuff? That kind of thing was unclear to me. I got a little bit of sense of how the scoring is done. That I think helped quite a bit because frankly, I was guessing before about how that worked out, and it sounds like it's pretty much the way I was expecting it, but you had a nice explanation. Why some leagues choose to have a requirement to include a tight end and others don't, it wasn't really clear why that was important. I thought that the idea was that you would be able to do this any place, and so the rules would all be consistent. If there's some reason that there's a difference, that would, I think, be worth talking about, and it would be interesting. The visuals that you showed in the first section where you were showing how the teams scored and how the points were accumulated, I thought that was pretty effective, except that it needed to be larger so that you could see that, and then maybe you could talk about some of the particulars. So you could say, for instance, in this example here, this quarterback threw for 300 yards. That translates into 8 fantasy points based on this scoring system that we have. So you can kind of put it together a little bit more so we can see how it all fits, as opposed to, well, I'm going to talk about this here and then I'm going to talk about this other thing someplace else. That felt a little disjunctive. Like I said, I thought the visuals were fine, except that I couldn't see some of the details on those first slides. When you had the scoring point list, that was relatively large and clear, although there's a lot of information on it. The information about how the employees feel about their jobs when they participate in fantasy football and how much more efficient they are. I kind of like the picture that you had with that, to make it more interesting, and it's not just a random statistic. That was okay. The graph that shows the increase in fantasy football over the last few years, I think that's an interesting point. Also, you might do some explanation about why it's gone that way. Is it the expansion of social media? Has it been promoted by the league? Is this one of those things because sports betting has become popular that this has advanced the use of or participation in fantasy football? I don't really get much of an explanation of it. I just get the number, and that feels like it's part of a thing instead of a whole thing. And that's sort of where I am with your whole speech, which is relatively brief. You had up to 8 minutes and you used 3 minutes and 34 seconds, so it's basically less than half the time gets used, and there are still, I think, a lot of questions that could be answered, and you can make it more interesting by telling us stories along the way. You're kind of going through the mechanics of, just let me explain some very basic things here, and then you're done, instead of going the extra mile to make it more interesting, more engaging, and to kind of relate the material to the audience. You're going to have to work a little bit harder on developing that content. All right, thank you.